Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Overpowering Emotions, where I talk all things big emotions and anxiety, emotion regulation. Today, I'm very excited. I have another special guest, Dr. Jon Gruda. He is very accomplished. I will have his full profile in the show notes for you, as well as links to where you can see his work and where you can connect with him. To introduce him for today, Dr. Gruda is an assistant professor in organizational behavior at Maynooth University in Ireland. He's a researcher focusing on all sorts of things that I wish we had time to go into: relational leadership, dark leadership traits. I'm fascinated by that. Personality and anxiety, which we'll be talking about today. Dr. Gruda, he completed his PhD in management together with a joint doctorate in psychology. He also has several master's degrees. One that's really fascinating to me, I mean, all of it's fascinating. He's very well accomplished. But his master's in effective neuroscience. And that's what inspired his work with colleagues on detecting anxiety using machine learning. And that's kind of one of the focuses that I wanted to talk about today. So thank you for joining me. It's going to be a fantastic discussion, and I hope you learn lots. Well, thank you so much, Jon, for joining me today. I'm very excited to have you on the podcast.
Oh, very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Caroline.
So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Jon Gruda. I'm an assistant professor in organizational behavior at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth, which is just outside of Dublin, Ireland. And been working on for 5 years now on various topics, one of them being anxiety and being measuring anxiety using social media data. And so that's started 5 years ago, and it's spun off in a lot of different, numerous projects over the years, which I only can, applaud my co-authors for sticking with me for this long. And yeah, so that's one of the major streams of research that I do, and then we apply, this application, this machine learning algorithm, in various ways, looking at specifically employee well-being, because I am an organizational psychologist academically in terms of background, and the numerous ways of how that develops over time.
Okay, well, sounds so interesting. So tell us maybe a little bit about just the anxiety through social media, that piece to start with.
Yeah, so that was like many things in life, I like to believe, coincidental. So I was sharing an office with a colleague from information systems, so computer scientist, and we quickly became friends, and we actually started work on the very same day, so we had a lot to bond over. And we were looking for a project to work on together, and anxiety was the somehow emerged as the number one project. And in hindsight, it kind of makes sense. I have, like I said, I'm an organizational psychologist academically background, but I also did a master's in affective neuroscience. And one of the specializations there was indeed anxiety, fear, anxiety, mood. So in hindsight, it kind of makes sense that it spoke to me as something that's very important and something that we could potentially contribute to. And then, of course, with the last few years having been particularly difficult to deal with due to the pandemic, I think that as a topic has really, emerged once again, and it's very much on people's minds all the time, basically. So we found really increasingly that this is something that people want to know more about, and we want to keep working on it. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, anxiety was always an epidemic, and we've definitely seen huge
that is
increases.
very true.
And we know there's a correlation with social media use. We tend to see more anxiety, depression, those types of things. So what have you found in your research?
So the very first, project that I mentioned I worked on with my colleague was about developing a way to measure anxiety in a unobtrusive manner. So if I were to ask you, how anxious are you, right? So I'm doing two things by doing so. First, I'm putting the thought of anxiety in your head. Right? You might not have been anxious at all, or rather you weren't really aware of it. I mean, there's always a baseline that we all have, which varies. Some people are more anxious, some people are less anxious in terms of frequency throughout the day and throughout the year. But by asking you this, I could have been making you anxious already. So I'm priming you to think in one way or the other, which is, we don't want that, right? Because we want to naturally measure, okay, so how anxious is Caroline at 8:30 a.m., on any given day? And how does that then develop over the course of the day or the week or the month or whatever it is? And so asking people is limited in terms of method. So we thought, how else can we do that? So we turned to a very abundant source of information, which is Twitter. And Twitter is also very good for researchers because it's public data. Mm-hmm. So people can tweet whatever you like, right? And we know some people really like to take advantage of that. So we can get that information, and then we can reverse engineer basically, what people have said at various times of the day, and then what kind of words they use, what kind of emotions do they communicate in those tweets. And the other part that we then did is not only is it unobtrusive, but also we gathered a large corpus of these tweets, and we showed it to, I think it was 600 raters to rate these tweets to say, how anxious do you think this person was at the time? But the caveat is we didn't actually ask how anxious do you think this person is, but how frustrated, how tense, how worried, how content as well, which is reverse coded. So that's for us, it's like the opposite of anxiety, right? Because not every tweet, of course, is anxious. So that gave us an observer rated measure of anxiety, which we can then feed into an algorithm that can now score millions of tweets, in a couple of minutes on anxiety. So that was the beginning, and then since then we've been working on various applications of this very same algorithm.
Okay, and so you're the one thing that kind of drew me to some of your work was this anxiety detection through your linguistic analysis. So what have you noticed in doing this kind of work? Are you trying to predict if someone has an anxiety disorder, for example, or what sort of?
So the short answer to that is no,
Okay.
because we stick to subclinical anxiety measures. So the scale that we use, where we ask people, please rate these tweets on how tense and how worried and so on, is a state trait anxiety scale. So it's subclinical, and we are in no way able to, nor do we want to, diagnose anyone or make predictions with regard to their individual mental health, going forward. What we are interested in is more population level anxiety. So, for example, we had one paper that we wrote during the COVID pandemic, which came out last year, where we looked at are extroverts or were extroverts more impacted by the pandemic at the beginning of the pandemic and then throughout the crisis than introverts? Because I do remember these these news articles saying call your extrovert friends and they're stuck at home and they can't do anything, they can't go out, they can't meet people, can't be social. And we wanted to see whether that is actually the case. And so what we did is we gathered lots of data from, I think it was 200,000 observations from just New Yorkers. And we focused on New Yorkers not because we are most interested in New Yorkers, but because if you remember, there was the pandemic hit New York, was one of the most affected areas at the very beginning. And so we wanted to measure, the beginning of the crisis. So after the 11th of March, I think, 2020, when it was announced to be a worldwide pandemic. And New York was one of those epicenters in terms of the US. So that's what we were most interested in. And indeed, it seemed, and the data shows it very nicely, actually, that introverts seem to have, you can almost say like they're a little bit buffered when it comes to the anxiety effects. So introverts in general, so people who score very low on extroversion tend to be, happy to be by themselves more than being around other people all the time. They don't draw energy from being around other people. So to them, at the beginning of the crisis, indeed, there was a little bit of a buffer effect where their anxiety levels weren't that impacted. And the extroverts, it goes up quite drastically, very quickly, until at some point, which I think was around 100 days into the crisis, so about 3 months or so after March 11th, the two meet. And so then anxiety was no longer distinguishable. So everyone was just anxious. And we explained that by saying, well, it takes a while for this to sink in. It takes a while for people to understand that this was, a really long-term environmental change that we all had to go through. I remember at the beginning they all sent us home, and it was like, well, this will probably last 2 weeks, so see you in 2 weeks.
Yep. Yep.
Uh, but it's been 2 years, so maybe even a little bit more than that. So it's something that people had to get used to first, as in that this is here to stay, and we don't have a vaccine, and we don't have a way out, and as you can imagine, this really drives anxiety levels of individuals quite drastically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you say that, because at the beginning I'm like, what pandemic? I
Yeah.
I am an introvert. My one daughter is as well. And we're like, this is fantastic. We don't have to go out. I don't have to feel bad about not going out.
Exactly.
But it does end up getting quite draining.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we know that there's differences in terms of personality that can help us predict our behavior in general, which means that extroverts like to be around other people and introverts much less so. But as a species, we're still very much a social species. So without social connection, we simply wouldn't exist as people, as individuals, as a population. So it is something very, very important, and it's a need to be around others and to be able to communicate with others. And I do think that extroverts and introverts both were able to, we all sought out other ways of doing that. They're not the same. Talking on Zoom is not the same as meeting in person, of course, especially when it comes to family members. But it was the next best thing. And at least it allowed us to communicate how we're feeling to others, which is also very, very, directly communicate, not just through social media, but on a call, essentially, to say that, today was a good day, or this is what I did today, and this is how I felt. And other people can, of course, converse with you, and they share their day with you. And that can be very comforting as well. So, it can, and also, at the very least, it's a little bit of a distraction, even though it might be very short term from what's going on around the world.
Yeah,
So,
there's
yeah,
still the connection, because we know, and I've talked about it on my podcast before, just the isolation. And we've seen with the pandemic how harmful it is, not just to our mental well-being, but our physical well-being as well. Uh,
absolutely.
all aspects. So fascinating. I've got so many different questions. I
Pick one.
guess I guess well, maybe we'll start. Any other interesting findings or patterns that you've noticed from your research?
Yeah. So we did write another paper which came out just a few months ago, uh, and I hope that there's a follow-up paper which is under review currently, which I hope will come out anytime now. So where we looked at we looking at organizational settings. So we looked at leaders impacting followers' anxiety on Twitter, and again throughout the pandemic. So we were interested in if a leader tweets something. A leader we define as like a CEO of a company tweets something on Monday. Their followers, does that affect their followers' anxiety that day, a day later, a few days later? And indeed, we find that it does 2 days in advance. So if a leader tweets on Monday, it impacts their followers. So what the followers tweet in terms of their anxiety communicated in those tweets on Wednesday. So the 2 days in advance, and the 2 days can be easily explained as in you're not going to be on Twitter all the time, you're not going to read all the tweets, and so you're likely to see at least some of those tweets that are coming from people that you know, people that you recognize, people that have some sort of power or authority in terms of your workload. So you do care, right, what they write. So that is an effect that we found, and the paper that's currently under review flips this around and looks at whether followers can impact leaders as well.
Okay.
And we do find that to be the case as well. However, they do need to be people who are close to the leader. So, someone who directly reports to a CEO, so like a senior director or a manager, that person certainly would have the capability of influencing what their leader is feeling in terms of anxiety. And again, it's this 2 days in advance, this pattern that we find.
Okay.
So, this again speaks to how social we are as human beings, and how important that is to make that social connection with others, where even when we are online, our feelings get transferred or get it's called emotional contagion, which has a very, very bad connotation now. I think contagion and viral and all these key words now it means something completely different than they used to. So, but that's what it's called. So that's the proper terminology. Where if I feel something and I'm in the same room with you, you're likely to feel some of that, whatever it is that I'm feeling as well. So if I'm in a bad mood, it's not going to make you a particularly happy person. And vice versa. If I'm really ecstatic, very happy, just received some good news, for example, it's going to, help other people feel happier as well. I mean, it's momentarily, it's not long term, but if you have repeated exposure to those individuals, then it can very much make a difference in terms of how you perceive and feel your life. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's two of my questions were, after 2 days, we sort of see that effect, but it doesn't sound like it lasts long.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah. But you have to keep in mind that, of course, people are tweeting, periodically, and they might not tweet every single day, 3, 4 times a day. But, some weeks more than others. But if you look at it over time, the pattern with the 2 days in advance seems to be quite solid. And it seems to be working in both directions. Yeah.
And I was going to ask about the emotion contagion. So that's certainly
Hmm.
something that you were seeing in your research. And I know that there was research, I think it was Reddit, and they were looking at depressive memes, suicidal sort of memes, those kind of things. And
Hmm.
the darker, more severe, self-harming or closer to being successful with suicide were the more successful posts, the ones that were
Oh,
most
yeah,
reshared.
absolutely.
Did you
Hmm.
notice that sort of thing happening
Yeah.
as well?
Yeah, so that's something that we talked about quite a bit actually, because we know this, like you were saying, the examples you gave, absolutely, and also when you look at any sort of crisis event which impacts a lot of people at once, so that they go on social media and they write what they share and feel. And I think the example that we gave in our paper was the uh, the nuclear catastrophe in 2011 in Japan, and how that triggered. A lot of people went online and started talking, and started reposting and posting news and so on. And yes, so the more negative emotion you have in what you post, the more likely it is to go viral and to spread. The more likely it is that people will repost it and share it with people that they know. And I mean, that's something really important, the source, who is the one communicating. Because if you read something and it seems to speak to whatever it is that you believe in the moment, which might be right, which might be wrong, doesn't really matter. When you reshare that to other people, especially your friends see that. Oh, but this is coming from Caroline. I trust Caroline. Caroline is my friend. So I'm going to pay more attention to this. I'm going to give it more value, more weight in terms of how much does this matter for my day or for how I perceive this crisis currently, right? So it makes a big impact, and so that's how it spreads from just a few people to just communities, and those communities are no longer localized; they're
Mhm.
worldwide now. So, and then the other aspect of this is especially on Twitter, which is an issue that 90%, I think it was 9%, the statistic in terms of misinformation and disinformation that is spread by just a very few people actually. So a small group of individuals who have either automized this approach themselves, or just keep putting out this kind of news that is then spread and shared, because the headlines are so catching that
Mhm.
people will click on it and they will read it. And whether or not you think that, well, I like to read the news, but I don't really, I'm very critical and I assess only the information, it still will impact how you feel if you do this, periodically, if you do this a few times a day. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and our brain is built to be on the lookout. We've got this negativity bias. And so we are just
Exactly.
soaking up all of those messages. And so I can see how it perpetuates and the misinformation. I work with a lot of teens, and I know social media is a huge problem
Mm.
in a lot of the families that I work with. And there's a lot of magical thinking. And so when they don't have all the information, they fill in the gaps. And so now it's just misinformation upon misinformation. And now we see all
Right.
these conspiracy theories, the earth is actually flat or whatever else, right?
Yeah.
And we're like, how do people
Absolutely.
believe this? But we see exactly how that happens. So
Yeah.
it's quite
And
fascinating.
and it's interesting because you mentioned the Earth is flat conspiracy theory, or community, let's call it. Um, there's a lot of them, and there's that community is growing. I mean, I'm not to be too surprised because the worldwide population is growing, so naturally there's going to be some more people there. But I mean, it's really it has picked up a lot of steam at least over the last decade or so. So
Right.
it's very interesting to me as well, like how some of these claims, which is what they are, then at some point get converted into this is the only truth and the only thing that matters. And so
Right.
I'm going to share it. I'm going to tell everybody about it. Yeah, but this negativity bias is exactly it. So that's the very reason why when something bad happens, not only does it impact us a lot, but we will tell everybody about it so that we protect them from this impacting them as well. It's like just be prepared. This might happen to you. I mean, this is
Hmm.
why gossip is so important as well. So because it gives you information, whether or not that information is factual, doesn't really matter as much. What matters more is the fact that something happens to you, you interpret it emotionally, and then you feel the need to share it with the people close to you, so as to protect them, your group, your community, from having to go through the same thing. So be
Right.
cautious, be on the lookout. So yeah, and that's something that I think social media just allows people to really exacerbate in terms of the effect that they can have on others, because it's now no longer me just talking to you, but talking to a whole bunch of people at the same time who I don't even know, but
Yeah.
I am nonetheless impacting them. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I think we could get into a lot of trouble, and I'm not going to go down here, but just to comment, I just look at, I'm from Canada. So everything that's happening in the United States, and it's just, yeah, it's very, very scary how influential one person or a small group of people can be.
Yeah.
And, I worry that there's going to be a civil war,
Mm.
but anyway, that's a whole other sort of topic.
Yeah.
So, so I guess, taking all of this, just looking at clinical implications, I don't know if you're able to address that piece. What do we do now with all of this information in our everyday life, whether it's an organization or parents with their kids or just in our own daily lives?
Yeah, I think in terms of the first finding, which is not really a finding as in it's something new, but it is something that we very much find even more evidence for, is the importance of being self-aware. So first of all, in terms of what others are doing and how that might impact you, but even more importantly, how your actions can impact others. So when you say something and you're saying it in quotation marks online, so you're tweeting or you're posting or you're communicating it online, uh, be mindful that this has an impact on other people you don't know necessarily, and even more so people that you do know. So when you are saying, when you're reposting whatever it is that you think the world needs to know about, um, think about it. Do the people that are closest to you, if they read this, what kind of impact would that have on them? Is this purely informational? So it's just here are some statistics, and you're not, telling the story. You're not tweeting something with those statistics. Like, look at these numbers, aren't they scary, right? But if you're just reposting it, what's the goal behind that, right? So be mindful in terms of others will affect you, and there's nothing wrong with admitting it to yourself first that what I read has an impact on me and how I feel at any given point in time. And of course you have power as well. So I mean, I'm in organizational psychology, we work a lot with leaders and followers, and people think leaders are people that have managerial power. That's actually nonsense, and I tell all my students this is nonsense. Leadership is about influence. So if you can influence others to work towards a common goal, so my goal is your goal, then you're a leader. So I ask my students, and I teach, 18-year-olds all the way to, 50 plus, uh, raise your hand if you are the older sibling, you know, if you're the oldest. And, half of the people, whatever the number is, they raise their hand. I'm like, see, you are leaders already, whether you like it or not. And of course, when I teach, people who are older than myself, that they have kids, right? And so you are also very much a leader, whether you like it or not, because you're a parent. So even when you don't think others are watching, and are observing what you're doing and what you're saying and how you behave, even when it's online. They very much are. And of course, they will then share it with others. So then that effect gets, it's a snowball effect, then it impacts other people and so on and so on. So just to make that analogy, how important it is to be self-aware and to realize that you do have power. So it's your responsibility not to abuse that power as well. And when you do read something that someone that you know has communicated online, and it brings up, you relate to it. You feel empathy, right? Maybe you've been through the same thing, or maybe it's just sympathy, right? You can just relate to this person as an I'm sure that's a very difficult time that you're having right now. You're going through something difficult in your life. Don't hesitate. Reach out to that person, because the worst thing is if they don't know you at all, they won't write you back, right? And then okay, no harm done in either way. And the best case scenario, something is, you write someone based on what they've written online, say, hey, I saw what you wrote, and I just want you to know, I've been through this, or whatever it is that you want to share with them. That can make all the difference. And so again, power and responsibility, right? So if you do see something that you can relate to that somehow hits you emotionally one way or the other, positive or negative, then do reach out, because social media is not. I strongly believe this. It's not as a tool. It's not good or bad. It's how you use it. So it has these effects which are negative, as in misinformation. Disinformation can spread very quickly, but so can the good messages, and allows us to connect to people that we wouldn't have been able to connect to all around the world. So use that. That's a tool, and you can use it to make an impact, to make a difference.
Yeah. I'm always teaching, because I work with a lot of families, and talking about how influential our words are, even just simple things, parents who will use safety language, hey kiddo, put on your seatbelt, but then they
Mm-hmm.
add this catastrophic piece, because otherwise you're going to go flying through the windshield and smash your head in,
Oh wow, yeah,
and
yeah.
so that's going to provoke anxiety. And so
Mm,
just those little messages, I think that this is huge, because we do see it on such a broader, grander scale on social media. So I think
yeah.
that this is really important. And I know for my girls, they don't have access to social media, even though I have a daughter in grade 11. She doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have any social media account, and nor is she interested. But I do still talk about being this, what kind of digital citizen do you want to be, right? How do you
Right.
want to show up? Because that's going to be with you, and that's going to stick with you. And
Yeah.
so I see some horrific posts of
Mm.
what teenagers, but adults as well, they put out there, and that's out there, and that influences people, and their perspective of you as well. So yeah.
Right. And then other people respond to what you've written, right? And then you read those responses, and it sometimes can push people to get even more edgy with whatever it is that they communicate out into the world. So it can push you to write things, or to post things, or to share things that you wouldn't have had done so otherwise, if they wouldn't have, responded in whatever way they did. I mean, most of the time it's enthusiastically. So that's the bidirectionality of, for example, anxiety as well, right? So if you post something, maybe you're communicating that you've had a bad day, or you're just not feeling like working, or whatever it is, right? And then other people respond to that, and they might just say, feeling the same way, hang in there. That's a positive response.
Right.
But others might be more antagonizing, and they might say, "Well, what did you do all day? That's so making you so anxious, right? Like you're, I don't know, you're sitting at home, you're working remotely, and it can't be that anxious, right?" And so that can, going back to what we were talking about at the very very beginning, if I ask you, please tell me how anxious you are, I'm putting the thought in your head, which you might not have had before. And if you did have it before, now to you it seems, oh God, so other people are realizing that I'm anxious. So it's out there. I don't want to communicate that, because we've been kind of taught not to communicate negative emotions to others. But of course we do all the time.
Yes.
And so it's not really beneficial for yourself or others. So the first thing is to realize that this is normal, that you will communicate even when you don't think you are. We call it in our terminology, it's behavioral residue. So it's what's left over of your behavior once you've posted. And like you said, it's out there. It's there forever. So that's the other issue, right? And I think that's very, very important to teach to teens and just to kids in general, that this is something that will be with you always. So think about it, once or twice before you know post that tweet or whatever it is. So yeah, that's something very, very important. And like you said, Caroline, your words have a lot of power. So be careful, or rather be wise in terms of how you use them.
Right. And I think a good message too for parents to be teaching their teens as well, just being sort of critical sort of consumers and knowing that our feelings really are influenced through that
Yeah.
social media piece. And so I think especially in the teenage years where they're more prone to anxiety and depression, and
Hmm.
now they're supporting, I've got so many teens who are supporting their friends who are suicidal or who have
Right.
eating disorders,
Mm.
and so they've got their own stuff. Plus now they're trying to support their peers. And I just think that it's just intensified too, through the social media piece. So there's
Oh,
so many.
absolutely. And it's so, I mean, it must be really overwhelming to them, because you like you said, you're dealing with your own emotions first and foremost, and then people that are in need, that are close to you, that your friends are going through something tough, and now you have to step up and be more than just a friend to them. You have to read their emotions, interpret them. You have to then manage your own in response to theirs, and that can be a lot for anybody, never mind somebody who is maybe 13, 14, and is going through this while attending school and doing sports and everything else that their social life demands. So yeah, that can be incredibly overwhelming. So it's very important to give them those tools as early as you can, and the only way to do that is to talk to them, to have conversations with them. But also, I think it's very important to share vulnerability. So when you are not, 100% sure about something, don't try to present it as black and white. You can say, well, this is how I think about it, but here's these other views, and this might be something that you can read on, and we can explore it together as well, and to see, you can make up your own mind. I think that's something that takes a lot of time because you have to do this periodically, all the time.
Yeah.
But I think those tools, I think your kids will certainly thank you, for a very long time in their life for having given them those tools. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Having those conversations are so important.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't, I mean, I still have a million questions, but we don't have a million hours to talk about everything.
Right.
But the one sort of big one that I'm wondering about, and maybe this isn't something that you noticed or addressed, but
Hmm.
did you notice, was there a trend between people who posted, positive, sort of hopeful, uplifting things versus more anxiety, sort of fear driven things? Or is it just kind of all enmeshed? I don't know if you noticed
So
any.
what do you mean with trend? In what way? In terms of the
You,
impact they have on others, or?
Well, are people who are more likely to post hopeful messages, positive messages, likely to follow people who also have the same sort of
Oh,
messages?
I see what you mean.
Or,
Hmm.
are we just versus, the fear mongers, I guess, and we're following them and that's kind of what we're posting? Or is everyone just, it's a little bit of everything, I guess?
Yeah, so that's an important point. So let me address it in two ways. So one, in general, we tend to follow those, engage with those that are similar to us, or that we see ourselves in them. We can relate to them on some level. Having said that, the study that was talked about earlier about followers in influencing leaders and vice versa, uh, there is something that we haven't talked about yet, which is, of course, that some people have a personality disposition to be anxious, trait anxious. So, in general, these individuals are more anxious than people who score less on trait anxiety, regardless of the circumstance. So, crisis, no crisis, important presentation at work, no important presentation, whatever it is, new environment, maybe a new school or new workplace, regardless of what it is, some individuals tend to score much higher on trait anxiety than others. So in that study that I was talking about, the results only held for less trait anxious leaders. So if a leader is super anxious all the time, right? Like this is just as a person, this is who they are. And then they tweet something that's anxious. Well, how are you going to interpret that? Well, let's say, John is tweeting, but John is anxious all the time. So, they're tweeting something anxious. So what? It doesn't really impact me as much because I know this person is in general, is very anxious. But if the person is not in general, what you would call very anxious, as someone who is not, in this field, like, well, just in general, this person doesn't seem to be anxious a lot. Then it's going to be so much more impactful when they do communicate something that has anxiety, within those lines, right, within the words that they choose. So that is an important boundary condition, so to speak. So all of this works very well, emotional contagion and so on. Yes, we find that online as well, but it's important to also keep in mind that personality matters. So some people are naturally predisposed to more anxiety, just like some people are naturally predisposed to being more extrovert or less extrovert, or more agreeable, more tolerant, more friendly people. And so that's something we have to keep in mind, that of course that matters. And who we are is defined by our behavior, by our actions, but it's also defined by who we are in terms of personality. So that's important. And when you are communicating with others, you don't know who's going to read it, right? So it might be somebody who's already quite anxious in general.
Right.
And now they read something that they might know you, or you might have some sort of power over them in terms of you might be their supervisor, whatever it is. And even though you're not speaking to them directly, right? Because it's Twitter, you're communicating into the universe, so to speak. They might read it. And if they do read it, that's going to have an impact on them, which neither you nor them might be able to point to and say, this is why I'm more anxious today than I was yesterday. But it's just, it translates into, more tension, maybe more frustration when they're facing obstacles or challenges throughout the day. So that's why it's really important, just want to emphasize that again, that, personality does matter as well. So you don't know who the other person is, not just as in their identity, but in terms of, what's their predisposition to anxiety, to depression, to, whatever it is, suicidal thoughts. It might be something, that whatever you write is the last thing basically that pushes them over that edge. And then they're going to be in a much worse situation than they were before. And again, you might not know about those consequences. And most of the time we don't. And they cannot point to you and say, you did this, right? So be mindful, really. And it takes a lot of practice to do that. And this is just for yourself. And then you have your own children, right? And you want to give them those tools as well. So that can be, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, but it's going to be incredibly beneficial for everyone to be able to practice this in a safe space and then be a much better communicator out in the real world.
And I do love the fact that you brought up, we don't know the influence we might have on others. And I think that's a problem with texting. I see so many people breaking up with each other on text, or saying something on text or social media, and we just have a good laugh, but we have no idea what's happening to that other person. When I was a kid, bullies, we were face to face, right? And we could see the direct effect of our words, but we don't necessarily have that. So thinking about that. Well, there's lots to think about. I know that we could probably go on forever. Is there any last minute, anything that you think would be really valuable for listeners to hear that we haven't addressed already?
I think just based on what you were just saying, just thinking about this, go through your WhatsApp or your texting, history with the people that are close to you, and just, keep scrolling up and just try to relive those moments when something was said, that was emotionally charged, one way or the other, whether you did it on purpose or not. It's very difficult to, even though these things happen to you and they happened to you in the past at some point, the longer in the past they've happened, the more difficult it is for you to go back emotionally, you would think, right? And try to feel whatever it is that you're feeling at the point in time. But do this, like just as a little exercise, and maybe you had an argument or something with someone and it was through texting, or or even on social media, and go through those messages and try to remember what you felt like emotionally at the time, and try to think about it cognitively. Is this how you would feel about it now? Or have you moved on since then? And maybe that exchange in that manner wasn't necessary really at all. Or maybe, just the tone was off from the very beginning. And can you try to think about what is it that you wrote and how did the other person interpret it? And why do you think they wrote you back in the way that they did? So that's something that we can do. Of course, we don't have 100% of the information, and we might never have it. What was the person feeling at the time, right? But we do remember what we felt like at the time. So trying to go back, and this is like a little exercise, right? So this already happened, right? It's in the past. And so there's no real repercussions from this impacting you in the future, unless this is still a very much emotionally charged topic for you. It's very much, it's very salient. It's very much on top of your mind. So pick something that is relatively safe. Okay, go through that exchange and try to make sense of it. And oftentimes, what happens is that we don't even remember why was it said this way, and why did the other person write back in that way. And I mean, even small things can make a big difference. For example, specifically with texting, right? So if someone writes you, like for example, I know if my wife writes me, I'll be home later, dot. And she never puts a dot at the end of the message, right? Like I know that there's something is up. Like there's going to be a conversation to be had very soon, because it's just out of the usual. It's just punctuation, right? But that can be an incredibly powerful signal both ways. It might be on purpose, or it might be, just it was autocorrect and it just added a dot at the end, or I was about to get in the car and I just texted you quickly, and so I didn't realize that I was communicating this. So that's something that can go both ways. So maybe it was something really minor. Maybe you were in a particular emotional situation at the time. It doesn't have to be something drastic. Maybe just very frustrated that day, or you felt very exhausted for whatever reason. And then someone writes you something, and you see it as a challenge or something that like, who is this person that's writing that to me, at this very moment? Don't they know how I feel? Of course they don't. So try to go back and try to reinterpret those situations and those messages, and try to think, how can this be done better going forward? And I'm sure there's going to be lots of different ways of how to address that in a more positive way.
Oh, I love that. That's a great little nugget. And actually, that's something I do with a lot of the clients that I work with, whether it's couples or parents with their kids. I do a lot of communication journals where they
Mm-hmm.
analyze what they said, what I said, how did it turn out, what could we look, some of the traps that we fall into. So I love that,
Right.
just to
Yeah.
extend some of this. So, well, thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure chatting with you. I know that this will be valuable for everyone who listens. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Thanks again for having me on. It was a pleasure.